You don't know what you're talking about. The words cut through the studio like shattered glass. Kellyanne Conway wasn't just debating. She was screaming. Her voice ricocheted off the walls, sharper than the glaring lights suspended above. The cameras zoomed in, hungry for the clash. The nation's living rooms became front-row seats to a moment of raw, unfiltered chaos. For a second, the room froze. Producers shifted nervously behind the glass. A few audience members gasped. Others leaned forward, waiting for the fire to spread. The tension was almost physical, like static electricity crawling up your arms before a storm. And in that storm, Kellyanne raged on. Her face flushed red, her hands slicing the air as if each gesture could cut down her opponent. Years of political bravado were pouring out in a single tirade, a display less about reason and more about domination. But domination has a way of revealing desperation. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett. Calm. Composed. Eyes steady, unblinking. Where Kellyanne's fury filled the air with noise, Crockett's silence spoke louder. The contrast was cinematic, one woman unraveling under the lights, another woman embodying a stillness that pulled all attention toward her. And here is the question that hung heavy over the moment: how does one woman's scream become another woman's legend? Because legends aren't born from chaos, they're carved out of it. The louder the insults, the brighter dignity shines. Viewers didn't yet know it, but they were about to witness something more powerful than a televised meltdown. They were about to watch a transformation, the instant when arrogance collapses under its own weight, and grace steps forward to claim the stage. Kellyanne thought her scream was the headline. But it wasn't. What happened next, what Jasmine Crockett chose to say, and the way she chose to say it, would silence an entire studio, shake the internet awake, and leave millions asking themselves a deeper question. Who really owns America's tradition, the ones who shout the loudest, or the ones who stand the tallest? And as the studio lights bore down, the answer was seconds away. Because Crockett was about to open her mouth. And the world was about to stop scrolling. What she said next would silence an entire studio, and light up the internet. The debate wasn't supposed to spiral like this. The producers had billed it as a straightforward discussion on truth, accountability, and the values that supposedly bind America together. But straightforward was never Kellyanne Conway's strategy. She came armed with something else entirely: chaos. For years, she had perfected the art of dominating by volume. Speak faster, louder, longer. Leave no oxygen for a rebuttal. Turn every exchange into a barrage, a verbal flood so overwhelming that facts drown before they ever surface. And tonight, under the glare of live television, Conway unleashed that familiar storm. Every question became a springboard into deflection. Every answer, a monologue designed to twist the frame. The studio filled with her voice, cutting, sharp, relentless. Her goal wasn't dialogue. It was dominance. It was making sure the audience at home felt one thing above all else, that she was in control. But here's the problem with chaos. When the goal is simply to overwhelm, the cracks eventually show. And as Conway raised her volume, her message began to shrink. The louder she screamed, the less weight her words carried. Sitting opposite her was Jasmine Crockett, the picture of composure. Where Conway's energy scattered, Crockett's focus narrowed. Where Conway's words spiraled, Crockett's silence sharpened the anticipation. She wasn't just representing herself, she was carrying something heavier. She was carrying the weight of dignity. Because for Crockett, this moment wasn't about trading barbs. It was about something larger, the principle that representation means standing firm when noise tries to erase reason. She knew millions of Americans were watching, many who rarely see themselves reflected in the halls of power or in the spotlight of major networks. She understood what it meant to be not just a politician, but a symbol, a voice of calm reason in a culture that too often rewards the screamers. And that's why this clash mattered. It wasn't just about Kellyanne versus Jasmine. It wasn't just two women on opposite sides of a table. This was a confrontation between two Americas, one built on volume, spin, and domination, and another that insists dignity still has a place in public life. Viewers could feel it. The tension wasn't just in the studio, it was in their living rooms, in their phones, vibrating through the comment sections that lit up the moment Kellyanne's scream hit the air. Everyone was asking, who's going to win this? Who's going to stand taller when the dust clears? And Crockett, sitting steady, represented the answer without even speaking yet. She was proof that sometimes restraint is more powerful than rage. That silence, held long enough, becomes a weapon of its own. But if you thought Kellyanne's first eruption was the peak, you'd be mistaken. Her strategy wasn't finished. Her desperation wasn't spent. The meltdown was still brewing, and the louder she shouted, the more unhinged the moment threatened to become. Because Kellyanne wasn't just raising her voice anymore, she was raising the stakes for herself. Each outburst boxed her deeper into a corner, forcing her to double down on the very chaos that was unraveling her credibility. And Crockett? She waited. The calm before the next storm. The quiet before the next scream. The patience of someone who knew the difference between noise and history. Because history was about to be made in that studio. But the meltdown was just beginning. To understand the scream, you have to understand the woman behind it. Kellyanne Conway didn't just appear out of nowhere. She carved out her place in American politics as a spin doctor for Donald Trump, and for years, she wore that title like armor. The nation came to know her not as a truth-teller, but as the queen of distortion, the one who could look directly into a camera, face the American people, and sell them alternative facts with a straight face. When the crowd gasped at Trump's words, Conway was there to smooth them over. When reporters pressed for answers, she was there to twist the narrative, to make lies sound like misunderstandings, and misunderstandings sound like grand conspiracies against her boss. She wasn't just a spokesperson. She was an architect of distraction, an expert in bending the public's attention toward the circus and away from the facts. That was her gift. And for a time, it made her indispensable. But here's the cruel truth about spin, it doesn't age well. The more you rely on bending reality, the more fragile your credibility becomes. And the very tactics that once made Conway untouchable eventually turned her into a punchline. Alternative facts wasn't just a phrase, it was a stain. A scarlet letter she carried into every interview, every public appearance, every attempt to stay relevant in a country that was slowly tiring of her act. Now, years after her White House days, the stage feels smaller. The cameras are still on, but the respect is not. For someone like Conway, who built her career on dominating airwaves, obscurity is the worst kind of defeat. So when she sat across from Jasmine Crockett, the outburst wasn't just about the debate topic. It wasn't just about defending conservative talking points or clinging to a fractured ideology. It was about something far more personal. It was about holding on. Holding on to relevance. Holding on to control. Holding on to a legacy that had already started to slip through her fingers. And that's what made the scream so revealing. It wasn't strategy, it was desperation. The same woman who once smiled slyly while weaving alternative facts into polite soundbites had lost her composure. The mask of the clever manipulator had cracked. What millions of viewers saw wasn't the polished spin doctor of 2016. It was someone cornered, someone fraying, someone terrified of fading into the background of history. And the contrast was brutal. Conway's entire career had been built on deflection, on keeping her cool while confusing the facts. But here, on live television, she wasn't dodging or weaving. She was yelling. Unhinged. Shrill. The woman who had prided herself on controlling the narrative was losing the narrative before America's eyes. For her critics, it was vindication. For her supporters, it was discomfort. For Conway herself, it was survival. She wasn't just shouting at Jasmine Crockett. She was shouting at the inevitability of irrelevance. She was shouting against the tide of history, against the weight of her own reputation, against the fact that the country she helped divide had grown weary of the chaos she represented. And yet, in all her noise, in all her fury, Conway revealed her greatest weakness: the louder she screamed, the more powerful her opponent became. Because across from her sat someone who understood struggle in a way Conway never could. Someone who had not inherited her platform from proximity to power, but who had earned it through resilience, through grit, through the long climb of representation in a system designed to shut her out. Kellyanne Conway believed her scream would dominate the room. But screaming at Crockett would prove her biggest mistake. Because across from her sat someone forged by struggle. Jasmine Crockett didn't stumble into the spotlight. She fought her way there. Before the cameras, before the political battles, before the viral moments that turned her into a household name for millions of progressives, she was a civil rights attorney in Dallas, Texas. Not the glamorous kind of lawyer you see in television dramas, but the kind who walked into crowded courtrooms filled with people society had written off, and argued for their dignity. She represented those who couldn't afford high-priced lawyers, who had no lobbyists, no platform, no microphone. Her work was never about chasing headlines, it was about defending lives. That's where she honed her voice. Not by shouting, but by mastering precision. She learned how to take a courtroom stacked against her and slice through the noise with facts, evidence, and moral clarity. She understood that when you fight for people who don't have power, composure isn't optional, it's the only weapon that works. And so when voters sent her to Congress, she carried that courtroom spirit with her. She didn't come to Washington to play the celebrity game or polish talking points for sound bites. She came to represent, in the truest sense of the word. Her oath wasn't to ego, it was to service. Her mission wasn't to dominate the noise, it was to bring clarity to the chaos. That composure didn't mean she was meek. Far from it. Anyone who had watched her in committee hearings or on the House floor knew she could clap back with wit sharper than a blade. When an opponent tried to belittle her, she turned it into a lesson. When pundits mocked her, she turned it into a spotlight. Crockett had a way of transforming insults into ammunition, of showing that dignity and strength weren't opposites, they were allies. Her community knew that spirit well. They had seen her at rallies, town halls, neighborhood meetings. They had watched her roll up her sleeves, not as a distant politician, but as a neighbor, a sister, a daughter of the same soil. When people in her district spoke of her, it wasn't with the distant reverence reserved for untouchable leaders. It was with pride, as if to say, she's one of us. She carries our voice into the halls of power. And carrying that voice came with a price. Every insult hurled at her, about her gender, her race, her accent, her very presence in Congress, was meant to break her. But Crockett saw it differently. She understood that every slight was preparation. Every time someone underestimated her, she added another layer of armor. Every time someone shouted her down, she refined her calm even further. She was not naive. She knew America's history. She knew that women like her were rarely invited into spaces of power, and when they got in, they were tested, scrutinized, provoked. She knew the sting of being talked over, the frustration of being caricatured, the weariness of being told to wait her turn. And she carried all of that into her seat at the debate table. Not as baggage, but as proof that she had survived worse and risen stronger. So when Kellyanne Conway raised her voice, when the shrillness of desperation filled the studio, Crockett didn't flinch. Because she had spent her entire career preparing for moments exactly like this. Where others saw chaos, she saw clarity. Where others saw insult, she saw opportunity. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't about ego or winning points on television. It was about the people who had entrusted her with their voice. It was about every courtroom client who had looked at her with hope. It was about every young girl watching from home, wondering if dignity could ever stand its ground against arrogance. And Crockett was determined to answer yes. Her poise wasn't passive, it was powerful. It wasn't silence, it was strength. She understood what Conway didn't, that volume doesn't equal victory, and that the loudest voice in the room isn't always the most commanding. Jasmine Crockett had walked into that studio with more than arguments. She carried history. She carried resilience. She carried the belief that service, not spectacle, is what defines leadership. And when Conway tried to drag the debate into chaos, Crockett did what she always had. She stayed composed. She stayed sharp. She stayed rooted in something deeper than the need to be seen. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to scream. She was there to remind America of something older, something stronger, something unshakable. And when Conway raised her voice, Crockett raised something stronger, dignity. The moment the cameras cut back from commercial, the temperature in the studio shifted. Viewers at home could almost feel it through their screens. Kellyanne Conway leaned forward, eyes sharp, her body language radiating combat readiness. The debate topic, accountability in American politics, had already stirred strong words, but now, Conway was done with measured tones. She was ready to turn the set into a battlefield. Excuse me, no, you don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, slicing through Crockett's remarks like a blade. Her hand shot into the air, index finger stabbing toward the ceiling, as if she could puncture the very roof with her certainty. The hosts tried to intervene, "Kellyanne, please, let her finish," but she wasn't hearing them. She was running hot, adrenaline flooding her voice, gesturing wildly, waving her arms with the fury of someone not trying to debate, but to dominate. It wasn't just interruption. It was invasion. Conway's strategy was the same as it had always been: overwhelm, confuse, flood the airwaves with volume until truth drowned in the noise. But across from her, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still. Hands folded neatly, eyes trained forward, not flinching at the verbal storm raging inches away from her. She didn't match Conway's gestures. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even blink more than once. That stillness became its own kind of statement. The hosts looked nervous, darting their eyes between the women, worried about losing control of the segment. The studio audience, usually quick to clap or chuckle during sharp exchanges, was silent, stunned into a kind of suspended disbelief. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Conway pressed harder. "This is why no one trusts you people. You think you can lecture America on values? You think you represent the truth? You don't know the first thing about accountability." Her words came in torrents, her voice rising, cracking at the edges, the shrillness of someone more afraid of losing ground than confident in winning it. Crockett did not move. She didn't mirror the chaos. She didn't try to cut in. She let Conway unravel herself, strand by strand, fury spilling out unchecked for the cameras to capture. That composure only made Conway's meltdown look sharper, uglier. Every gesture Conway made, the finger jabs, the sharp waves of her hand, the impatient scoffs, bounced off Crockett like bullets hitting steel. The more Conway shouted, the calmer Crockett looked. The contrast grew unbearable, and the tension became a character of its own in the room. For a few seconds, it felt like live television had turned into theater, one woman thrashing against the spotlight, the other holding it effortlessly with quiet gravity. And then, finally, Conway stopped. The silence that followed was electric. You could hear the faint hum of the studio lights, the creak of a camera crane shifting its lens. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens, sensing that something unforgettable was about to happen. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but carrying a weight that cut through the silence. She didn't shout. She didn't perform. She simply spoke, as though addressing the millions watching at home instead of the woman sitting inches away. The eruption had been loud. But what came next, Crockett's calm, surgical reply, would be louder. For a moment, the silence in the studio was deafening. Kellyanne Conway's outburst still lingered in the air like the residue of smoke after fireworks, loud, bright, but fading fast. The hosts didn't dare speak. The crew behind the cameras stayed frozen in place. And Jasmine Crockett, calm, unshaken, steady, let that silence work for her. She leaned ever so slightly forward, eyes narrowing not with anger, but with focus. The pause stretched long enough that even viewers at home leaned closer, waiting, anticipating, almost whispering, "What is she going to say?" And then, with a voice measured and unwavering, Crockett began. "Kellyanne," she said softly, "I understand why you're shouting. When you don't have facts, all you have left is volume." The line landed like a clean blade. There was no malice in her tone, no mocking smile, just a truth delivered with surgical precision. The audience let out a sharp inhale, and even one of the hosts raised an eyebrow, caught between awe and disbelief. Crockett didn't stop there. She continued, each sentence calm and deliberate, like a surgeon making incisions too precise to resist. "You talk about accountability, yet you built your career on alternative facts. You stood beside a president who made lying a national pastime. And now, when faced with the truth, your instinct is to scream over it. That's not leadership. That's desperation." Cameras zoomed in on Conway's face. For the first time in the segment, the unflappable spin doctor looked rattled. Her lips tightened, her jaw clenched. She tried to interject, "That's not," but Crockett raised her hand gently, not in anger, but as if silencing the noise itself. "I listen to you," Crockett said firmly, still without raising her voice. "Now it's my turn." The authority in her calmness silenced even the host who had been preparing to step in. It was as if the room itself deferred to her composure. Crockett turned slightly toward the camera, and with that pivot, it became clear her words weren't just for Conway anymore. They were for America. "You say I don't represent values," she continued. "But let me tell you what values look like. Values look like showing up for your community when nobody is watching. Values look like standing up for the truth even when it's unpopular. Values look like respecting the people who put their faith in you, instead of feeding them lies to protect your power." The rhythm of her words was steady, each pause deliberate, each phrase striking harder because of her refusal to shout. The tension in the studio was unbearable, a live duel between chaos and composure, with composure winning by sheer discipline. Conway tried again to push back, a half-hearted, "Well, that's just," but the sound of her voice felt small now, weak against the rising tide of Crockett's conviction. And Crockett pressed on. "You've made a career of telling people what they want to hear. But I've made a career of telling people what they need to hear. That's the difference between you and me. You serve a man. I serve the people." The audience gasped audibly. The hosts, who had spent the better part of the evening playing referee, exchanged wide-eyed glances. This was no longer a debate, it was a dismantling. Conway shifted in her chair, visibly frustrated. Her hand twitched as though reaching for another interruption, but something in Crockett's unyielding calm made her hesitate. And that hesitation, that crack in Conway's armor, was all Crockett needed to drive her final point home. "You think shouting makes you strong," she said, leaning forward just slightly, her voice soft enough to force everyone to lean in and listen. "But real strength isn't in the volume of your voice. Real strength is in the weight of your truth." The words hung in the air, heavier than any shout, sharper than any insult. Conway sat back, blinking rapidly, her mouth opening but no words coming out. She looked suddenly smaller, like the force she had tried to wield had collapsed in on itself. The once dominant spin doctor, queen of the televised clash, had been reduced to silence. Meanwhile, Crockett didn't bask. She didn't gloat. She simply folded her hands again, still and composed, as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. But the audience knew. The hosts knew. And millions watching at home knew. They had just witnessed a live television moment, the kind that doesn't just play out, but reverberates. The studio erupted. Not in applause, this wasn't a late-night comedy bit, but in an energy that felt almost electric. People whispered, exchanged glances, shifted in their seats. And in living rooms across the country, viewers grabbed their phones, already clipping the moment, already typing captions. "Jasmine Crockett just destroyed Kellyanne Conway," without even raising her voice. Conway tried one last time to salvage control, her voice cracking as she muttered about liberal media bias and the real America, but it was too late. She had already lost. The more she spoke, the clearer it became, the villain had unraveled, and the hero had ascended. And Crockett? She didn't need to say another word. She had already spoken the kind of truth that doesn't just win debates, it defines them. The host finally cleared his throat, trying to move the show forward, but even he seemed reluctant to interrupt the weight of the moment. Well, he stammered, I think we've heard quite a bit tonight. But the truth was, the debate was already over. The war of words had ended not with the loudest scream, but with the quietest strength. As the cameras slowly pulled back for the wide shot, Conway shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her shoulders slumped. Crockett, by contrast, sat upright, collected, the very picture of composure. One woman's meltdown had become another woman's legend. And that's when the internet exploded. The broadcast had barely cut to commercial before the first clips hit the internet. In living rooms, dorm rooms, and offices across the country, people grabbed their phones, scrubbed the DVR, and uploaded the showdown in real time. Within minutes, TikTok was flooded with edits. One clip zoomed in dramatically on Jasmine Crockett's face as she delivered the line, when you don't have facts, all you have left is volume. Another stitched her calm rebuttal over Conway's red-faced shouting fit, contrasting serenity with chaos. By the time the network returned from its commercial break, the hashtags were already climbing the charts. Hashtag CrockettCom. Hashtag Kellyanne Meltdown. Hashtag Strength in Silence. Twitter, or X, depending on who you asked, lit up like wildfire. Journalists, influencers, comedians, everyone seemed to have something to say. Jasmine Crockett just gave a masterclass in composure, one political commentator tweeted. Another wrote simply, Kellyanne got rattled. Jasmine didn't even blink. Memes surfaced within the hour, Conway's furious expression side by side with Crockett's serene smile, captioned, when you do your homework versus when you wing the test. Over on YouTube Shorts, the moment took on a cinematic life of its own. Creators spliced Crockett's mic drop with inspirational soundtracks, Hans Zimmer's Time, dramatic bass drops, even lo-fi beats for emphasis. On TikTok, users added captions like, "This is how you deal with a bully at work." The clip became more than politics, it became personal, relatable. People saw themselves in Crockett's restraint, in her ability to stay grounded while someone screamed at her. Then came the celebrity reactions. A Hollywood actress tweeted, "Every young girl should watch Jasmine Crockett tonight." Poise noise. A legendary basketball player posted the clip with the comment, "This is how champions handle pressure." Even a country singer, not known for weighing in on politics, shared the moment with the caption, "Strong and steady wins the race." Late-night comedians couldn't resist either. One quipped, Kellyanne Conway screamed like she was at a rock concert, and Jasmine Crockett replied like she was at the library, and somehow, the library won. But beyond the humor and memes, there was something deeper stirring. Teachers began sharing the video with their students, framing it as an example of conflict resolution. Corporate trainers used the clip to illustrate emotional intelligence in high-pressure environments. One therapist posted a breakdown on Instagram, explaining how Crockett's breathing, body language, and refusal to escalate created a mirror of calm that neutralized Conway's chaos. The reaction wasn't just about politics, it was about people hungry for models of composure in an era of constant outrage. "This is how leaders handle bullies," one viral tweet read, echoed by thousands of likes and retweets. For many, Crockett's poise wasn't just impressive, it was inspiring. Viewers wrote comments like, "I showed this to my teenage daughter so she could see what real strength looks like." Others admitted, "I wish I could stay that calm when my boss yells at me." And Conway? The fallout was brutal. Her defenders scrambled to frame the moment as passionate, but the internet was unforgiving. Headlines in online outlets read, "Kellyanne Conway loses it on live TV," and "Crockett's calm goes viral as Conway crumbles." Comment sections overflowed with words like unhinged and desperate. Cable news replayed the exchange endlessly, with pundits dissecting every pause, every glance. One analyst said, "This wasn't just a debate, it was a demonstration." Crockett understood that sometimes the loudest voice isn't the strongest one. Another put it more bluntly, Kellyanne shouted. Jasmine won. By the end of the night, Crockett's follower count on Twitter and Instagram had doubled. Donations quietly flowed into her political campaigns from people who had never even heard of her before that evening. She had gone from rising star to household name in a matter of hours. But the most remarkable part? Crockett didn't bask in the victory. She didn't gloat online or give fiery soundbites afterward. When reporters pressed her for a reaction, she smiled and said simply, "I believe the truth speaks for itself." It was that restraint, that refusal to fan the flames, that made the internet love her even more. By dawn, the clip had become a cultural touchstone. Teachers, pastors, parents, and activists alike were quoting her words, "Real strength isn't in the volume of your voice. Real strength is in the weight of your truth." The moment transcended politics, it became a meditation on leadership, on grace under fire, on the power of composure in a world addicted to shouting. And yet, as viral as the exchange had become, Crockett wasn't finished. Because later that week, she would step in front of the cameras again, not to spar with Kellyanne Conway, but to reframe the entire debate into something bigger. Something America desperately needed to hear. But Crockett wasn't done. She reframed the entire debate into a lesson America needed to hear. In the days after the clash, Jasmine Crockett stepped back into the spotlight, not to bask in her viral fame, but to redefine what the debate had been about all along. For many, it was just a fiery television segment gone off the rails. But Crockett saw it as an opportunity, a chance to speak to something deeper, something more enduring than a shouting match. When the cameras returned to her later that week, she didn't bring up Kellyanne Conway's outburst, nor did she boast about the viral victory that had made her name trend worldwide. Instead, she leaned forward, calm as ever, and reframed the conversation around a single word, tradition. For too long, she began, her voice measured, deliberate, tradition has been used as a shield for power. It's been twisted into meaning obedience, obedience to those who shout the loudest, to those who hold on to privilege the tightest. But tradition, real American tradition, is not about blind obedience. It is about struggle. It is about reinvention. It is about resilience. There was a pause, the kind that draws listeners closer rather than pushing them away. America's greatest tradition, Crockett continued, is not standing still, it is moving forward. Every generation has fought to expand the meaning of freedom. Every generation has pushed the walls of inclusion wider, has taken the promise of this nation and made it more real. That is our tradition. Reinvention. Resilience. The courage to begin again. The studio grew quiet, almost reverent. For the audience, this wasn't a political figure scoring points. This was a leader turning conflict into clarity. Her words carried the weight of history, but also the immediacy of lived experience. In that moment, Crockett embodied a contrast too sharp to ignore, dignity over arrogance, truth over noise. Where Conway had erupted in a storm of gestures and volume, Crockett had become a still center, anchoring the conversation in values that resonated beyond partisanship. Her message rippled outward. People didn't just hear her words, they felt them. They felt them in classrooms where teachers replayed her speech as an example of civil discourse. They felt them in community halls where organizers nodded, recognizing their own long fights for justice in her framing of tradition. They felt them in quiet homes, where parents told their children, that is what leadership looks like. On social media, the conversation shifted. It was no longer just about a viral meltdown, or even Crockett's legendary composure. It was about the lesson she had drawn from it. Tweets and posts echoed a single refrain, her calm was our calm. Her dignity was our dignity. People identified with her restraint because it mirrored their own struggles, staying composed in the face of bosses, bullies, critics, or life itself. Crockett's poise became a shared victory, a collective act of resistance against the culture of noise. And in the silence she left after her words, something lingered. A realization. The power of tradition isn't in repeating the past, it's in redefining it. It isn't in clinging to what was, but in courageously building what can be. Crockett didn't need to shout it. She didn't need to fight fire with fire. She had shown, instead, that the greatest strength is often found in restraint, in clarity, in truth spoken softly but carried widely. Her performance that week wasn't just a rebuttal to Conway. It was a mirror held up to America, a reminder that dignity still moves people, that truth still resonates louder than any scream, that progress has always been the truest tradition of all. As the broadcast wrapped and the credits began to roll, there was a sense that viewers had witnessed something rare. Not just a political skirmish, but a moment that distilled something universal. And in the retelling, one line lingered, a line that turned the viral spectacle into legend. And the world will remember not the scream, but the silence that followed. In the end, the title told the story best. Kellyanne Conway screamed, but it was Jasmine Crockett's calm reply that became the headline. One woman tried to control the room with noise, but another commanded it with composure. The contrast could not have been sharper, and the result could not have been clearer. Screams fade. Outbursts get lost in the echo chamber. But truth, delivered with clarity, discipline, and dignity, has staying power. Crockett's reply was more than a viral moment. It was a reminder of what leadership looks like when ego steps aside for principle. In an age where shouting often feels louder than substance, Crockett proved that the opposite is true. Noise burns hot but dies fast. Truth, when spoken steadily, stands tall long after the smoke clears. That's why millions replayed her words. That's why people said they saw themselves in her calm. And that's why this clash won't be remembered as Kellyanne Conway's scream, but as Jasmine Crockett's silence that spoke louder. And now, the story is in your hands. Because this wasn't just a television segment. It was a reflection of a choice we all face. Do we fuel the division with more noise? Or do we steady ourselves, rise above, and remind the world that dignity is the tradition worth preserving? So here's the call: if you believe America's real tradition is dignity, not division, not arrogance, not fear, share this story. Tell it, post it, pass it forward. Every time you do, you're not just amplifying Crockett's reply. You're amplifying a message that our nation desperately needs: calm is stronger than chaos, truth is stronger than noise, and dignity is stronger than any scream.